Book 1, Chapter 3 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alan Winterowd. Armadale by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 3, Day and Night. The morning hours had passed. The noon had come and gone, and Mr. Brock had started on the first stage of his journey home. After parting from the rector in Douglas Harbor, the two young men had returned to Castletown, and had there separated at the hotel door, Allan walking down to the waterside to look after his yacht, and Midwinter entering the house to get the rest that he needed after a sleepless night. He darkened his room. He closed his eyes, but no sleep came to him. On this first day of the rector's absence, his sensitive nature extravagantly exaggerated the responsibility which he now held in trust for Mr. Brock. A nervous dread of leaving Allan by himself, even for a few hours only, kept him waking and doubting, until it became a relief rather than a hardship to rise from the bed again, and, following in Allan's footsteps, to take his way to the waterside which led to the yacht. The repairs of the little vessel were nearly completed. It was a breezy, cheerful day. The land was bright, the water was blue, the quick waves leaped crisply in the sunshine, the men were singing at their work. Descending to the cabin, Midwinter discovered his friend busily occupied in attempting to set the place to rights. Habitually the least systematic of mortals, Allan now and then awoke to an overwhelming sense of the advantages of order, and on such occasions a perfect frenzy of tidiness possessed him. He was down on his knees, hotly and wildly at work, when Midwinter looked in on him, and was fast reducing the neat little world of the cabin to its original elements of chaos, with a misdirected energy wonderful to see. "Here's a mess!" said Allan, rising composedly on the horizon of his own accumulated litter. "Do you know, my dear fellow, I begin to wish I had let well alone." Midwinter smiled, and came to his friend's assistance, with the natural neat-handedness of a sailor. The first object that he encountered was Allan's dressing-case, turned upside down, with half the contents scattered on the floor, and with a duster and a hearth-broom lying among them. Replacing the various objects which formed the furniture of the dressing-case one by one, Midwinter lighted unexpectedly on a miniature portrait, of the old-fashioned oval form, primly framed in a setting of small diamonds. "You don't seem to set much value on this," he said. "What is it?" Allan bent over him, and looked at the miniature. "It belonged to my mother," he answered, "and I set the greatest value on it. It is a portrait of my father." Midwinter put the miniature abruptly into Allan's hands, and withdrew to the opposite side of the cabin. "You know best where the things ought to be put in your own dressing-case," he said, keeping his back turned on Allan. "I'll make the place tidy on this side of the cabin, and you shall make the place tidy on the other." He began setting in order the litter scattered about him on the cabin table and on the floor. But it seemed as if fate had decided that his friend's personal possessions should fall into his hands that morning, employ them where he might. One among the first objects which he took up was Allan's tobacco jar, with the stopper missing, and with a letter, which appeared by the bulk of it to contain enclosures, crumpled into the mouth of the jar in the stopper's place. "Do you know that you had put this in here?" he asked. "Is the letter of any importance?" Allan recognized it immediately. It was the first of the little series of letters which had followed the cruising party to the Isle of Man, the letters which young Armadale had briefly referred to as bringing him more worries from those everlasting lawyers, and had then dismissed from further notice as recklessly as usual. "This is what becomes of being particularly careful," said Allan. "Here is an instance of my extreme thoughtfulness. You may not think it, but I put the letter there on purpose. Every time I went to the jar, you know, I was sure to see the letter, and every time I saw the letter I was sure to say to myself, 'This must be answered.' There's nothing to laugh at. It was a perfectly sensible arrangement, if I could only have remembered where I put the jar. Suppose I tie a knot in my pocket handkerchief this time? You have a wonderful memory, my dear fellow. Perhaps you'll remind me in the course of the day, in case I forget the knot next." Midwinter saw his first chance, since Mr. Brock's departure, of usefully filling Mr. Brock's place. "Here is your writing case," he said. "Why not answer the letter at once? If you put it away again, you may forget it again." "Very true," returned Allan. "But the worst of it is, I can't quite make up my mind what answer to write. I want a word of advice. Come and sit down here, and I'll tell you all about it." With his loud boyish laugh, echoed by Midwinter, who caught the infection of his gaiety, he swept a heap of miscellaneous encumbrances off the cabin sofa, and made room for his friend and himself to take their places. In the high flow of youthful spirits, the two sat down to their trifling consolation over a letter lost in a tobacco jar. It was a memorable moment to both of them, lightly as they thought of it at the time. Before they had risen again from their places, they had taken the first irrevocable step together on the dark and tortuous road of their future lives. Reduced to plain facts, the question on which Allan now required his friend's advice may be stated as follows. While the various arrangements connected with the succession to Thorpe Ambrose were in progress of settlement, and while the new possessor of the estate was still in London, a question had necessarily arisen relating to the person who should be appointed to manage the property. The steward employed by the Blanchard family had written, without loss of time, to offer his services. Although a perfectly competent and trustworthy man, he failed to find favor in the eyes of the new proprietor. Acting as usual on his first impulses, and resolved at all hazards to install Midwinter as a permanent inmate at Thorpe Ambrose, Allan had determined that the steward's place was the place exactly fitted for his friend, for the simple reason that it would necessarily oblige his friend to live with him on the estate. He had accordingly written to decline the proposal made to him without consulting Mr. Brock, whose disapproval he had good reason to fear, and without telling Midwinter, who would probably, if a chance were allowed him of choosing, have declined taking a situation which his previous training had by no means fitted him to fill. Further correspondence had followed this decision, and had raised two new difficulties which looked a little embarrassing on the face of them, but which Allan, with the assistance of his lawyer, easily contrived to solve. The first difficulty, of examining the outgoing steward's books, was settled by sending a professional accountant to Thorpe Ambrose, and the second difficulty, of putting the steward's empty cottage to some profitable use (Allan's plans for his friend comprehending Midwinter's residence under his own roof), was met by placing the cottage on the list of an active house agent in the neighboring county town. In this state the arrangements had been left when Allan quitted London. He had heard and thought nothing more of the matter until a letter from his lawyers had followed him to the Isle of Man, enclosing two proposals to occupy the cottage, both received on the same day, and requesting to hear, at his earliest convenience, which of the two he was prepared to accept. Finding himself, after having conveniently forgotten the subject for some days past, placed face to face once more with the necessity for decision, Allan now put the two proposals into his friend's hands, and, after a rambling explanation of the circumstances of the case, requested to be favored with a word of advice. Instead of examining the proposals, Midwinter unceremoniously put them aside, and asked the two very natural and very awkward questions of who the new steward was to be, and why he was to live in Allan's house. "I'll tell you who, and I'll tell you why when we get to Thorpe Ambrose," said Allan. "In the meantime, we'll call the steward XYZ, and we'll say he lives with me because I'm devilish sharp, and I mean to keep him under my own eye. You needn't look surprised. I know the man thoroughly well. He requires a good deal of management. If I offered him the steward's place beforehand, his modesty would get in his way, and he would say no. If I pitch him into it neck and crop, without a word of warning, and with nobody at hand to relieve him of the situation, he'll have nothing for it but to consult my interests, and say yes. XYZ is not at all a bad fellow, I can tell you. You'll see him when we go to Thorpe Ambrose."